Hey guys, welcome to the first video of Unit 5, and in Unit 5 we're going to look at environmental microbiology. We're going to look at the role of microorganisms play in an ecosystem. But before we can do that, let's get a little background on ecology and what an ecosystem is. Now, we've already studied in this course, and we've done it in lab and all that stuff. You guys know now, microorganisms, bacteria in particular, are everywhere. We find them in our air, soil, our food, in the water. We find them everywhere. So it's healthy for us as humans to understand that microbes are going to be a part of our environment. In order for us to control disease, we need to understand the roles that these microorganisms play in our environment. In order to keep us healthy and to keep our planet healthy, it's a good idea to know what role these microorganisms are playing when we're talking about where they fit in. Now, if you ever look at studying, the entire ecosystem, the whole planet, you need to have a good idea or a good background in ecology. Now, ecology is a study. Ology refers to a study, and it's the study of the relationships between organisms and their environment. So the living, which we call the biotic factors, and the abiotic, which would be the environment or where they live. So an ecosystem can be different scales. We can talk about the planet as a whole ecosystem, or we can talk about a country, or we can talk about a forest, or we can talk about a lake or a river. So an ecosystem depends on what scale you're talking about, but what every ecosystem has in common is that it has the environment, which are the abiotic factors like the atmosphere, the rocks, the water, things that are non-living, and then it has the biotic component. So the microorganisms, the plants, the animals, and everything like that that live in that ecosystem. So, like we were just saying, the ecosystem will have two major components. The first one is the living part, or the biological, and then the second one is the physical, or the non-living part. So the biotic will refer to the biological, and the abiotic, which the A in front of a word generally means not or no, refers to the non-living or no living, the physical components of that ecosystem. So if we look over here on our little figure here, when we're talking about the abiotic, we're talking about minerals, we're talking about nutrients, habitat in general. These disturbances will mostly be, well, in this case, a fire would be abiotic, so would the solar radiation from the sun, the moisture in the air. All of these things would be abiotic. Then if we keep looking at this, now we can look at everything here that's living. So we've got ducks, we've got fish, we've got a plant community, we've got a different plant community. There's something living in the woods here, probably a rabbit or a bird. Over here there's another different type of trees. Those are all going to be part of the biotic system, or the living parts of that ecosystem. So an ecosystem together makes up this biotic part as well as the abiotic part. And every ecosystem will have this in as a feature. The idea of ecology is studying how these two parts come together and how these two parts interact with each other. Now, a little bit more about ecology before we move on to the rest of the unit. But when we're looking at microorganisms in the environment, it's a good idea, like I said, to have a background in ecology. So we'll look at a couple of different words here, and I'll try and give you a good definition of each one so that you can take it with you as you go through. But if we start here with a population. Now, if I say population, most people think of the number of people. All right, that's generally the way it works. When we say population in ecology, we're talking about the number of organisms of the same species. So if we were in a classroom, I would say, what's the population of people in this classroom? And for us, if everybody was present and I was there as well, we would have 8 people. But I can also talk about the population of bugs that are in that classroom, or I can talk about the population of bacteria that are in that classroom. A population is just limited to members of the same species. Okay, so it's a pretty small measurement. Now, a community is kind of the next step up. So a community is when we look at groups of different populations living together. So again, if we go back to our classroom example, if I talk about the community of the classroom, now I'm talking about the population of people, the population of bugs, and the population of microbes that live there. Okay, so hopefully those two definitions are easy to understand. The next idea is the idea of a niche. A niche is what a certain organism does in that environment. A lot of times I'll say that a niche is the job that an organism does when it's living in that certain environment. So it's how it fits in. So a niche can be how that organism makes its living. So is it a predator, like at the top of the food chain where it eats other organisms? Is it a plant where it produces food for the whole ecosystem? How does that niche fit in with the biotic and the abiotic parts of the environment? And this idea of a niche right here is a little bit harder to understand than those two ideas up there, but hopefully it'll become clear as we keep going through our notes. Now, microorganisms have the privilege of being a consumer, a producer, as well as a decomposer. And we're going to get into those roles as we go through the next couple of slides. Alright, if we have a look at this slide here, what we're doing is we're having a look at a basic food chain. Now everyone can probably recognize that. We get energy from the sun, and energy is transferred down to first level is our plants. These are our producers. So our plants take energy directly from the sun and turn it into biomass. Now that energy that's produced to that carrot is eaten by the next player in our food chain here, which is the rabbit. So that passes on energy from the plant to the rabbit. And then along comes our lynx behind that, and our lynx will eat the rabbit. So the energy from the rabbit is now transferred to the lynx. The whole time this is happening, organisms are losing energy in the way of heat. Okay, so we produce heat in order to keep ourselves warm, in order to have healthy metabolism, but this energy is also lost to the environment, so we can't get it back again. So hopefully this idea right here is something that everyone's seen before in biology, and that's the idea of a basic food chain. Now, what we're really interested in when we're talking about microorganisms in the environment is this part of the food chain down here that often gets left out. This is known as the detritus food chain. Now the detritus food chain comes into play when all of the organisms that are in the the grazing food chain, these all will end up eventually dying. And when they die, the bacteria come along and they're going to be our decomposers. They're going to do their metabolism. They're going to use nutrients that are in the bodies of each one of these organisms and break it down. That allows all the nutrients in these organisms to be returned to the soil, or in some cases it can be returned to the atmosphere if it's gases, and then these nutrients can go back into the food chain, and we start our food chain all over again back here at the producers. So I've just taken a very simple idea of a food chain where the sun gives us energy, the plants turn that into biomass, the rabbit eats the plants, and the cat eats the rabbit. When we're talking about it from a microbiological point of view, it's the decomposers down here in this step that we're really interested in. Now, decomposition or breaking down of organic substances like that rabbit and the cat that we've seen in our last example, it's a very complex process. It's carried out by a couple of different organisms. Bacteria and fungi are definitely the most important in this role. And decomposers are organisms that feed on dead organic matter. Dead organic matter is often cause detritus, which is where that food chain gets its name from, the detritus food chain. If we look up here in the figure on the top right, we get another look at our food chain. This one's a little bit different down here. We get our producers over here, our plants, and then we get our herbivore. Instead of a rabbit, this time it's a giraffe. And then instead of a lynx, this time we get a jaguar cougar, it looks like. So here's our grazing food chain that we talked about at first. So this is the one hopefully that everyone can recognize from high school, from other biology classes. But then we get into our detritus food chain up here. So we get our decomposers, our bacteria and our fungi. They will carry out their metabolic reactions. They'll produce a lot of heat, and they'll turn our organisms in the grazing food chain into carbon dioxide, nitrogen, minerals, all of the things that plants will need to move forward and start all over again. So it is a big cycle, and it's very, very interesting how all of these ideas get tied together. Now, when it comes to recycling, soils play a large role. Nutrients and chemicals in nature get tied up in soils, and there are a ton of microorganisms to be found in soil. In fact, a soil is actually sometimes considered a living thing because there's so many bacteria and viruses and fungi that live there. A lot of the microorganisms that live in soil will carry out these biochemical reactions that will recycle elements, compounds, and molecules. One example of these bacteria that live in the soil are these bacteria that are called the nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And they play a super important role in recycling nitrogen. And we'll talk about that in a later video. Now I want to introduce this idea of biogeochemical. So bio, we're talking about living things. Geo, we're talking about rocks and the environment. And chemical, we're talking about different chemical species. So biogeochemical cycling. This is the idea of how all of the nutrients from the abiotic world and the biotic world come together to make up an ecosystem, and how they get recycled from the living to the dead and back again. So biogeochemical cycling, if we think about it on a big scale, like the whole planet, can be really, really interesting, and it can be very, very complicated. So over here we've got an idea, we've got a picture over here, and I don't want you guys to get too worried about the details of it, not quite yet anyways, but the idea of this biogeochemical cycling, like I was saying in the other slide here, is how we move elements and compounds through the ecosystem. So how it'll go from the abiotic world, which is, remember, just the physical characteristics of the environment, into the biotic world, which is the living characteristics or living parts. And nutrients and compounds will cycle through each part of this ecosystem in a cycle. And if you look up at the picture on the top right here, we get the carbon cycle and a nitrogen cycle. What this is trying to show you is that these global patterns are dependent upon each other. We need to have these functioning effectively in order for our planet to be effective and to be healthy. Now, bacteria play a really huge role in this recycling of nutrients and elements. So we're going to have a look at some of these major biogeochemical cycles, the water, oxygen, and carbon cycle. And then we're going to have a look specifically at the roles that bacteria play in cycling nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus.